Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 90, and today we're going to talk about John Coltrane's 1965 album, A Love Supreme. It's a single work in 4 movements. It's a meditation on spirituality and on his own personal quest to find God. What I have here is the 1967 stereo release, by far the most superior one I've heard. It absolutely comes alive. You hear things in this, you can hear people's breathing during the solos and so on. There's so much depth to this particular release. To understand this album better, it helps to take a tiny little deviation to musical theory. So in the early 60s, what's happening is Coltrane is moving away from modal jazz, and that's jazz which is based on a single chord as opposed to a chord progression. That's what you get on the album Kind of Blue, for instance. This is tonal music. It's anchored not on chord progressions or even on chords, but on different tonic notes. So think of a song basically having one note which serves as the home base of the song. That's essentially what using a tonic note is. So Coltrane comes out of the Navy. He's besotted with Charlie Parker, Coleman Hawkins, other sax players at the time, Lester Young. Charlie Parker in particular is a hero to him, as he was to most saxophone players at the time. They saw Parker performing at this incredible level while using heroin frequently. And so they made the logical, if not necessarily the physically sustainable link between Parker's playing and his heroin consumption. So Coltrane, like a lot of other young jazz players, began using heroin. It didn't really suit him very well. On pure talent, he ended up playing with Miles Davis, but Davis ends up firing him because he ends up showing up in the bandstand drunk or dirty or wearing old clothes, looking disheveled. Coltrane cleans up and he has a profound spiritual awakening in 1957. That's significant for his own life, but it's also significant for this album, as we'll see. He starts working with Thelonious Monk, and this is a period which is extraordinarily influential in Coltrane's development because Coltrane was constantly seeking, constantly exploring, constantly trying to find a way to articulate what he had in his head and his heart and to be able to play that. And to his great frustration, Davis never wanted to talk about music, was withdrawn and cool, pretty taciturn guy. Monk, by contrast, wants to talk about music all the time, wants to hang out all the time, wants to play music all the time, found Coltrane a very inspirational partner. They recorded music together, which doesn't actually get released until 1961. Coltrane is effectively being rehabilitated. He's clean, he's back in the big time because he's working with Monk and playing with Monk, and Davis gives him a second chance. When Coltrane comes back into Davis's band the second time, it's pretty clear that his star is seriously on the rise. In 1958, he released Blue Train on Blue Note, his only album for Blue Note. Great reviews, tremendous album, and he comes into Davis's band in the back of that. Coltrane plays on Kind of Blue, but he's itching to leave, and they basically come to an agreement that whenever Coltrane can get a band together, he will leave. There's no better example of how Coltrane was constrained in the latter stages of his time with Davis than you can find on a recording from Stockholm from the last tour which Davis and Coltrane did together when Coltrane was in the Davis group. If you listen to So What, the solo played by Coltrane is absolutely mind-blowing, and you can tell essentially you have an immovable object and an unstoppable force, and something had to give. So Coltrane goes out on his own. He'd known McCoy Tyner from Philadelphia. Tyner comes in 1960 along with Elvin Jones, who'd been playing with Mingus and Davis and a lot of other people in the 1950s in the New York scene. In come a couple of other players to augment the group. There's Art Davis and Reggie Workman, who come in at various points on bass. Eric Dolphy, who comes in as a second saxophone. And you get Ole Coltrane, you get Live at the Village Vanguard, some really out there experimental playing, and Coltrane is starting to get slayed by the critics here, who are calling this anti-jazz, anti-music. They're referring to him as angry, and there's a little bit of anxiety around his commercial viability. But he continued in his live work to search and explore, push the boundaries. So in terms of the album itself, it was recorded in 4 hours by the quartet at Rudy Van Gelder's famous recording studio in New Jersey. There are a couple of other players in the session as well who do not appear on this album, but are actually on lots of the recorded outtakes, and that's Archie Shepp, who is there as a second saxophonist, and also Art Davis on bass. Anyway, Van Gelder does his normal stellar job, and the production is handled by Bob Thiel, and he also took several candid photos during the recording, one of which Coltrane shows here for the cover, which shows him looking serious and preoccupied, which is the theme of this album. So it's clear from listening to it, and it's clear from reading the notes that Coltrane wrote himself, and it's clear when you read the interviews that he gave, that Coltrane from the get-go saw this as more than just another piece of music. For him, his music was now an extension of his religious belief. He not only selected the cover art, he wrote the liner notes. He also wrote an extended poem in here, more on which later, which actually has a key role to play in this album, as we'll discover. He secludes himself for 5 days. Alice Coltrane, his wife at the time, says essentially he comes down effectively from the mountain after that 5-day period with this sense of peace and fulfillment. You know, telling her, I finally had the music come to me in a way that it's a full suite, what I want to say, what I want to express, it's all come to me. Interestingly, it almost didn't get recorded, because after Coltrane had recorded 5 long and fairly experimental pieces on Crescent, Theo basically came to him and said, look, can we be doing more standards? Can we be doing more commercial pieces? And Coltrane was willing to do that, but he desperately wanted to do something like this, and so he began to reach out to other record companies to see if he could actually record with them as opposed to Impulse. That never happened. Theo relented, and I'm sure he's happy about that, or was in retrospect, and we all are, because whatever combination of things came together for this album was the absolute perfect combination. Coltrane comes in with the music. He had not shared the music with the band before the recording session. They learned it there at the session in that 4-hour period. They turned the lights down low. He wanted to recreate that club feeling, because most of their great improvisational and experimental and imaginative work had come in the clubs. And he also gave them, other than a few sketches, one of which you can see here, a minimal set of instructions as to what he wanted. And he knew he could rely upon them with simple instruction to produce this soaring elegance that you get on this record. So what you have is a 4-part suite. Acknowledgement, in one of the 2 or 3 most famous passages of jazz ever, starts with this gong and these cymbal washes and Coltrane extemporizing on tenor sax, and then things settle down and Garrison comes in with that famous 4-note bass riff around which the rest of this movement is built. Tyner's playing fourths on piano, which was a very characteristic style of his when playing with Coltrane, and then Coltrane's solo is based on the motif. He does a variety of variations of this until he comes back to the motif itself, plays it 36 times in a row, using all 12 keys, but not necessarily in any particular order. And when he's finished with those 36 recitations on saxophone, he then chants the title of the whole suite, A Love Supreme, a bunch of times, and it's not actually the whole band, it's actually just him overdubbed. And then the song concludes with a bass solo from Garrison. Amazing stuff. The second and third movements are a lot more structured in a traditional sense in terms of actually having a chord progression than the first and the fourth. This is a much more upbeat, active feeling piece. The motif riff is played by Coltrane, then you're into a Tyner solo, which is lovely. All of the work by all of the players here is great, but Tyner, I think, shines so much here. The rhythm section is just flying. This is one of these pieces that really, really swings, just like there's one of those in the third movement as well. Coltrane comes in, his solo also has an urgent feel, and at the end, I really do feel as though the music conveys a sense of determination, of resolution to embark on a journey of faith and to pursue God and to realize that relationship. Pursuance begins with an Elvin Jones solo. What an incredibly fluid player this guy was. And then Coltrane comes in with what I think is the most joyous riff of any particular figure that he plays on the album. It's underscored by a Tyner solo, which is equal parts fast and fluid. Coltrane is overblowing like a fiend, and then he returns to the main riff, but he's doing it in a higher register. And then just as he started it, Elvin Jones ends the piece as well. You can feel that he must have been flying so fast that he kind of needed, just like a drag racer, needed a 1/4 mile with a parachute just to slow down. Then we're into the last and the most interesting of the 4 movements, which is Psalm. And that starts with an extended bass solo from Jimmy Garrison. It's not often mentioned, this bass solo, when you read about this album. In fact, most reviews don't mention it at all. I think it's one of the real high points. And then you get to Coltrane's piece. And what Coltrane is doing here, as Lewis Porter discovered, is essentially playing the words to the poem, which called The Love Supreme here, with his saxophone. Once you learn this, it's remarkable to actually follow along, read along as he's playing, because he absolutely does. And he doesn't just, as Porter points out, play in time with what the words would be. When words might be said forcefully, he's forceful with the saxophone. When there's something beautiful or reflective, he plays it in a beautiful or reflective way. It's really quite a piece of art, this. And apparently also his band members did not know this either. Elvin Jones has said we had no idea what he was doing when he was doing that. So what can I possibly say that hasn't already been said? Well, I'll give it a stab. It's one of the greatest albums made, really, in any style of music. It is brilliant musicians, arguably most brilliant moments, surrounded by other brilliant musicians, probably only possible due to the symbiosis that he had with his band members at the time. They had minimal instruction. They create one of the greatest works of art musically of the 20th century. I'd normally just say listen to it, but actually I would say this one you need to listen to it, then learn about it, and listen to it again once you've learned about it, and the experience is that much richer. 5 out of 5 seems like a gross understatement, but it's 5 out of 5.